cursed. Chosen. Heralded by the tolling of bells, a unit of green-robed knights advances across the dusty plains as the hot sun beats down upon their disease-scarred bodies. They fear not the embrace of death. No, that fate was sealed long ago. Guided now only by faith, they seek but one outcome in the battle ahead, a redemptive release to their suffering, the glory of a martyr's death. And so they plunge headfirst into the teeth of the foe. The year is 1244, the location Herbia. Here, the fate of the Holy Land once more lies in the balance after a century and a half of crusading. So dire is the situation that among the ranks of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its knightly orders come the doomed men from the house of St. Lazarus. For the past 100 years, they have carried out a mission both sacred and grim, caring for the sick and leprous, all while bearing the stigma of the very affliction they sought to treat. In doing so, they have taken in the outcasts of society, not only easing their pain, but also giving them purpose. With the blessings of the papacy and the kings of Europe, this has involved the founding of many new hospitals and colonies with which to expand the care of their brotherhood. In the waning years of the Crusader states, however, they have been urged to take up arms in defense of the cross. Thus do they now carry their legacy of devotion and sacrifice onto the battlefield. This is the story of the birth, death, and resurrection of the Leper Knights of St. Lazarus. The First Crusade of 1096 kicked off a tumultuous new chapter of violence in the Middle East. While the leaders of this movement couched their invasions as a fight in defense of the faith, the chaos they sowed across an ever-expanding war zone made the situation far more dangerous for the everyday person. Even when the invaders had secured Jerusalem for themselves in 1099 and established a series of fledgling Crusader states, the victory did little to make safe the passage of Christian pilgrims. With manpower often in short supply and reliant on immigration from Europe, these new rulers struggled to mobilize enough resources for the defense of the realm. To make matters worse, when given the choice, time and again the Crusader states chose to focus on outward expansion rather than internal stability. Each new wave of violence only further exacerbated the regional unrest. By the 1110s, groups of bandits regularly preyed on pilgrims and merchants in the Holy Land, with many regions becoming effectively impassable. The situation proved so dire that local groups were forced to take matters into their own hands. Among the first to act would be the monks at the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. Even before the First Crusade, this group had spent decades treating sick and injured pilgrims. But now, with war raging on their doorstep, things had truly got out of hand. Thus it was that in 1112 they asked the papacy for, and soon received, independence from Jerusalem. Now, with greater autonomy, they were able to take in donations of money and arms with which to provide escorts for pilgrims. This service would see them evolve into the Order of the Knights Hospitaller. Next came the Order of the Knights Templar. They had begun as a vigilante band who adopted the more aggressive stance of taking the fight to the bandits. For this, they received official recognition from King Baldwin II in 1119 and eventually from the Catholic Church itself in 1129. By then, the scope of their mission had expanded to securing the roads and simplifying the logistics of traveling from Europe to the Holy Land. In time, there would be dozens of military orders spread throughout Christendom, combining monastic rules with the military professionalism of knights, each specializing in particular things. For example, the Order of the Holy Sepulchre guarded the holy places in Jerusalem. The Teutonic Knights focused on assisting Germans, and the Livonian Brotherhood of Christ Knights protected priests seeking to convert the pagans of the Baltic. But perhaps the most specialized military order was the Order of St. Lazarus. They began as a strictly medical offshoot of the Hospital of St. John that could offer specialist care for those suffering from leprosy. Leprosy is a chronic infectious disease caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium leprae. Over years and decades, it damages the skin and nerves, slowly causing its victims to lose their sense of touch and fine motor skills if untreated, as well as developing a severe rash across the body and eventually affecting sight and mobility. While leprosy is not in and of itself fatal, it does weaken the immune system and increase the risk of dying to another illness. Furthermore, leprosy's tendency to limit pain perception makes it difficult to notice wounds or assess the symptoms of other diseases, making it less likely that a leper will seek treatment for potentially fatal injuries or illnesses. While leprosy is treatable today with antibiotics, medieval doctors could do nothing but ease the symptoms and watch as their patients became less and less able to live their daily lives until some other illness eventually killed them. Medieval attitudes to leprosy were complicated and appear to have been rather polarized. On the one hand, there were those who regarded it as a curse and were disgusted by the appearance of the afflicted. However, others drew upon the words of the New Testament for a different interpretation. In the Gospel of Luke, for instance, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man reveals that the disease-ridden beggar is the one truly deserving of heaven. Meanwhile, the Gospel of John tells how Jesus resurrected and healed another man by the name of Lazarus, also assumed to have had leprosy. Thus, Scripture showed that leprosy was a mark of the chosen, and that those who treated them were following in the footsteps of Christ. While today leprosy is quite rare, it was once endemic to the Eastern Mediterranean. Unfortunately, its chronic and progressive symptoms required specialized care that most medieval hospitals were not equipped to provide. Furthermore, many were unwilling to live or be treated alongside lepers. For these reasons, lepers were usually sent to specific hospitals or colonies where they could receive the care they needed without risk to the wider public, and where they could be kept out of sight and out of mind. At some point in the 11th or early 12th century, the Knights Hospitaller established such a hospital outside the gate of St. Lazarus, at the northwest corner of Jerusalem. Given its relative isolation, this institution grew distant from its hospitaller founders, evolving into their own order following a monastic rule based on that of St. Augustine. Yet, while many of their peers were becoming increasingly militarized in the 12th century, the Order of St. Lazarus was not among them. After all, leprosy rates had nothing to do with the internal security of the Crusader states, so there was initially no reason for them to field an independent military unit, especially given their proximity to the Hospitallers. Delving into our sources reveals no references to combatants among their ranks. However, what we do hear of is praise for the moral value of the order. It would be this recognition which allowed them to grow. This began locally at first. In 1142, they were granted additional land by King Fulk of Jerusalem to support the leper colony. Yet, as rich pilgrims and crusaders spread word of their deeds, the Order of St. Lazarus was invited to establish similar hospitals and colonies across Europe. Among the greatest boons to their prestige came in 1174 with the ascension of Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem. News of his affliction led to a surge in public donations and patience to the order, while favour from the royal family itself further propelled them to new heights. Yet, even still, they did not militarize. It was only after the conquest of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187 that the order finally took up arms. At the time, the Sultan had kicked out the knightly organizations, giving them a 1-year grace period to relocate their operations. Thus it was that the Order of St. Lazarus moved its primary colony and hospital to Acre. In the aftermath, The Third Crusade was called to reconquer the Holy Land. The offensive proved partially successful in reclaiming some lost territory, but ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem. When peace returned, it left the Crusaders with a tenuous foothold in the region. In such a state, they proved desperate for any manpower they could get. This left the Order of St. Lazarus in a position to finally take up arms. After all, a knight with leprosy was still a knight. These knights, known as Lazarites or Lazars, would have had normal equipment for a knight. Fighting primarily on horseback, they sat in a high saddle with supports behind and before, with their feet lodged into stirrups, which made it possible for a cavalryman to remain firmly in the saddle during a rapid charge without being thrown off on impact. Their armour would have also been standard for a knight: padded clothes, a coif for the head, a gambeson for the torso, and chausses for the legs. For defence, most of your rank-and-file warriors donned chest armour. Over the mail, a mantle was worn to identify them as a member of the Order of St. Lazarus. During the 13th century, when the Order fielded troops, some basic plate armour was being adopted to protect the shins and joints. Their primary weapon on horseback was the lance, while their secondary weapon was a sword. Beyond that, knights equipped themselves according to personal preference. Some preferred long swords, others a poleaxe. Others still liked the short sword and shield, or perhaps a two-handed axe. It was up to them. However, due to the muscle weakness that can come with leprosy, it is likely that most knights would have preferred to fight with lighter and well-balanced weapons like short swords. The Order of St. Lazarus is strongly associated with a green cross. However, the earliest evidence of a green cross being present in the Order's heraldry comes from regulations circulated by Siegfried von Schlatt, dating to 1314, which mentions the green cross of this holy order, which was to be worn on the habits, mantle, and harness of its members. This is around 90 years after the first evidence of their militarization, leaving the development of this heraldry lost to history. It is possible that, as an offshoot of the Knights Hospitaller, they initially adopted Hospitaller heraldry and switched to the green cross later in their history. But it is probably more likely that they adopted it as soon as they became an independent military order, to distinguish them from the others. With individuals thus equipped, let us now consider their unit organization. The rarity with which the order is mentioned in accounts of battles suggests that their presence was usually insignificant and limited to the smallest units of medieval cavalry. Without additional information, we can assume that such a group may have adopted the generic name of banner, while its commanding officer was known as a knight banneret. Such formations could be tiny. For example, when the French Lord John of Joinville joined the Seventh Crusade from 1248 to 1254, he brought just 10 knights. More powerful lords, on the other hand, typically had 40 to 50 knights under their singular command, while delegating control of the rest of their troops to other officers. Ordinarily, each banner would then be combined into larger, more standard units at the discretion of senior commanders. However, given that the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus were carrying a highly visible infectious disease, they may have been periodically ostracized and not integrated into army command structures. Writing about events in 1252, John of Joinville described them as having no formal position within the army, making them irregular troops. In terms of training, the Knights of St. Lazarus would likely have had a military career prior to joining the order. Indeed, our records show that, as of the 13th century, the Knights Templar and Knights of Jerusalem required their members to join the order if they developed leprosy. Likely, this had been an informal practice even earlier. However, we should also note that as of 1253, non-leper knights were also permitted to join. Given this unique method of recruitment, there was a constant trickle of experienced recruits, and intensive training was not required. Instead, the order focused on helping knights to come to terms with their condition and treating what symptoms they could. Perhaps some, like Baldwin IV, learned to ride without a bridle if leprosy cost them the use of their hands. But beyond this, there was little the order could do to help. In battle, their standard tactics would have been the same as any formation of knights, but with one grave modification. They would have marched in a formation of close rows, gauged an opportune moment to charge with their lances like other heavy cavalry, and then committed to charge. However, where most cavalry would attempt to disengage and reform, the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus seemed happy to attack targets beyond their capability and put themselves in needless danger, deliberately courting death. The Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus had to be theologically careful here. These knights were well aware that their condition was only going to get worse, and were also aware that to be killed in battle against an enemy of the church was a martyr's death that would assure a place in heaven. In other words, many would have privately gone into battle hoping to die. However, they also knew that suicide was a grave sin that could cost them the place in heaven that they craved. There was a line between reckless aggression, a tactical misstep that cost many knights their lives, and suicide by battle, and the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus hoped to walk that tightrope into heaven. As historian Helen Nicholson puts it, they were suicidally reckless. As such, it is perhaps a mistake to even talk of the order as having tactics in a conventional military sense. Given their master was sometimes ostracized by other commanders, it seems they were not perceived as having significant military value, perhaps in part because their existence as a military unit was a means to a non-military end. To grossly oversimplify the problem, it seems they did not want to win battles. Rather, they wanted to die in battles and get their members into heaven through a martyr's death. This, combined with the obvious military disadvantages of expecting people with an illness that affects fine motor skills to wield a lance and sword, means that their service history makes for grim reading. With that being said, it will nonetheless be worth reviewing. We can pick up their service history in the early 13th century. Here, it is certain that the order had formed a military wing by 1227, when Pope Gregory IX addressed a letter to the order as having militibus, meaning soldiers, and to order itself as a militi hospitalis, or military hospital. Further evidence comes from 1234, when the military wing had accrued considerable debts, and Pope Gregory IX urged the faithful to donate to the order for the defense of the Holy Land. Their first recorded battle was fought in October 1244 at Forbi, a village northeast of Gaza. This battle was among the most important in their history. On one side was deployed a combined army of Crusader state forces, the might of the military orders, the forces of Muslim Syrian lords, and around 2,000 Bedouin. Against them was arrayed the Ayyubid dynasty, led by Rukn ad-Din Baybars as-Salihi, based in Egypt, and the Khwarezmians, a roving band of mounted warriors formed from the remnant of the main Khwarezmian army after the Mongols had invaded and broken the Khwarezmian Empire in the 1220s. Importantly, in our study, this is the only battle where we can firmly locate the position of the order within a parent army. The Christian forces, including the Order of St. Lazarus, formed the western flank near the coast, the Syrian Muslim forces in the center, and the Bedouin on the east. After each side clashed indecisively on 17th of October, Baybars thought the Syrian Muslims sent by Damascus were the weakest part of the line, and on the following day ordered the Khwarezmians to charge them head-on. He had judged correctly, and the Khwarezmians overwhelmed the Damascene formation before turning towards the Bedouins and destroying them too. With their allies crushed and the highly effective Khwarezmians now on their flank, the Christian wing of the army stood no chance. In such a situation, it is likely that the Leper Knights would have charged eagerly to their doom. Unfortunately, their precise fate is unknown. All that remains is a chilling letter sent after the battle from the Patriarch Robert of Jerusalem. In it, he desperately begs Europe for a new crusade on account of the sheer devastation to the knightly orders. His accounting shows that only 33 Templars, 27 Hospitallers, and 3 Teutonic knights survived the battle, and that, quote, all the leper knights of the House of St. Lazarus were killed. News of the crushing defeat at Forby and subsequent crisis in the Crusader states prompted the Seventh Crusade, which operated from 1248 to 1254 under King Louis IX of France. In the years between their destruction at Forby and the arrival of King Louis IX, the Order of St. Lazarus managed to reform their military unit, probably drawing on newly diagnosed leper knights and less able-bodied knights spread across their hospitals. Thus replenished, they joined the Seventh Crusade in their campaign to take Egypt from the Ayyubids, marching south from Damietta toward Cairo. However, their role was extremely small, and their participation is attested by only a couple of comments in our sources. In 1250, the Seventh Crusade suffered a comprehensive defeat near the town of Mansoura. Although the crusade enjoyed early success and killed the Egyptian commander in his camp during a surprise assault 3 kilometers from the town, the Crusaders later marched into the open gates of Mansoura itself, expecting minimal resistance. Instead, it was a trap. Egyptian troops had been scattered across the town and fell upon the Crusaders as they spread out and let their guard down. As the Crusaders retreated from the ambush and headed north, they were assailed constantly for days and weeks, until on the 9th of April, they were finally surrounded, crushed, and surrendered with the capture of King Louis IX. Our only reference to the Knights of St. Lazarus at this battle is one comment in the work of the great chronicler Matthew Paris, quote, in this last year of the last half-century, the Saracens triumphed at will, and the whole Christian army consisting of the nobility of all France, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Knights of the Teutonic Order of St. Mary, and those of St. Lazarus, was cut to pieces in Egypt, and at the same time also, Louis, the pious king of the French, was taken prisoner. But their role in the Seventh Crusade was not over. King Louis IX and 12,000 prisoners had been ransomed from the Egyptians and attempted to salvage what they could of their expedition by fortifying the Crusader states. The campaign is described in great detail by one of its participants, John of Joinville, in The Life of St. Louis. But even he only mentions the Order of St. Lazarus once, and not at Mansoura, but in an ill-fated cattle raid that did not impress him. While the king encamped outside Jaffa, the master of St. Lazarus spotted cattle and other things he thought might be seized as bountiful plunder at a location near Ramla, 3 leagues away. Since he had no formal position within the army, he did whatever he liked without talking to the king, and so off he went. When he had gathered his loot, the Saracens attacked him and overcame him so thoroughly that of all the men with him in his battalion, only 4 escaped. As soon as he got back to camp, he raised a call to arms. Joinville mentions this only because he was the one who led a force of knights from other military orders to rescue survivors and drive off the enemy. After this debacle, Pope Innocent IV decreed the year after that knights without leprosy may join the order, since all leper knights of the said house had been miserably killed by the enemies of the faith. After this, the Order of St. Lazarus remained a small but notable military order, with a mixed membership of leper knights and regular recruits, similar to those of the other orders. Their final action in the Holy Land was when the last bastion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the city of Acre, fell in 1291. At this time, the order had just 25 knights, who all perished. Although the military activities of the order stopped for a long time after the fall of Acre in 1291, it had a brief and bizarre resurrection as a military unit. The order still had leper colonies throughout Europe, and their medical activities continued. In 1489, the papacy ordered that they be absorbed into the Knights Hospitaller, hoping that their resources could help the Hospitallers defend against the Ottoman invasion of Rhodes. However, this was not followed in France and Italy, where they continued to exist as independent but separate orders. In 1564, the papacy ordered the Italian Lazarites to fight piracy, and in 1572 they merged with the Order of St. Maurice to form the Order of St. Maurice and Lazarus under the command of Duke Emmanuel of Savoy. They were required to contribute 2 galleys for the defence of Christendom against Ottoman naval activities and for general anti-piracy duties. The French Lazarites, perhaps inspired by their Italian brethren, offered to merge with another military order to form the Order of Our Lady of Mont Carmel and St. Lazarus, and fight piracy, and the English, in the waters off northern France. They provided 2 galleys in the Anglo-French War of 1666.